Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone got something to eat and we all settled down. I'm Salila Kursresht, and I would like to extend a warm welcome to everyone on behalf of the Humanities Research Fellowship for the Study of the Arab World, which is run by our NYUAD Research Institute. Today we have with us Professor Julia Stephens, who's a senior fellow at the Humanities Research Fellowship. Julia is a historian of South Asia who studies the entangled histories of law, religion, family, and economy in South Asia, in the Indian Ocean world, and in wider diasporic networks. In her earlier work titled Governing Islam, Law, Empire, and Secularism in South Asia, published by Cambridge in 2018, Julia has focused on the intersection of law and Islam in colonial South Asia. In her current project, she is exploring wider geographies as she traces the lives and legacies of Asian migrants who traveled across the Indian Ocean in the 19th and the 20th centuries. She has been following the trails, and in a very detective-like approach, trails of migrants and their families, some of whom were Bengali sailors who became restaurateurs, Ismaili trading families, and these networks which have linked South Asia with the Swahili coast and the Persian Gulf. She's examining family business histories, legal records, but also some rather fascinating material, some neo-archives and sources, such as pieces of personal jewelry, cemeteries, photographs, oral histories, and even digital ancestry platforms. In her presentation today, Julia will be talking on the gendered histories of capital, Islam, and politics in the Indian Ocean through the life and legacies of Janbai Topan, the matriarch of a Gujarati-Khoja family in the 19th century. We will start with Julia's presentation, and at the end, we'll together take all the questions and suggestions and comments. Thank you. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you so much. I'm going to put this on because I think for the that will work. So thank you, Salila. I mean, Salila is one of so many people on campus who have made this time in Abu Dhabi so productive for me. So I want to thank formally the Humanities Research Fellowship for enabling me to be here this year, but really almost like every person in this room who has welcomed both myself and my family for the year. And really already my research has benefited so much from the kind of intellectual stimulation of being part of this community. So my talk today is going to focus on tracing the life and legacies of Janbai, who is the matriarch of a major Indian Ocean family business that operated across Western India, Eastern Africa, and the Gulf in the 19th century. First, though, I thought it would be helpful for me to say a bit about my larger book project, and this is sort of a chapter of that book, although also is sort of taken on other forms as an article, and so I'm kind of thinking about it in multiple kind of formats. So I'm writing a book on diasporic South Asian families and processes which I'm calling legacy making. I'm using this term to capture the interrelated processes by which families transmit material assets and immaterial memories. Each chapter of the book focuses on a particular individual or family in different regional locations. And I'm using this as a way of creating what I hope will be kind of human-centered narratives within a book which is really very expansive in terms of geography and its kind of chronological period. So the research for the book primarily focuses on families who first migrated from India during the period of British colonial rule. So from approximately the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century, 30 million Indians migrated abroad. And as you can see from the map on the slide, the largest numbers migrated to Southeast Asia, East and Southern Africa, and the Caribbean. These numbers, however, are based on official statistics and best capture Indians who moved along official routes. Many others, particularly merchants and those who traveled by dhow or overland, may not be reflected in the official statistics. So for example, for the circuits that connected India and the Gulf, official migration numbers are almost certainly artificially low. Nonetheless, these numbers point to major differences in South Asian migration in the long 19th century versus today. So according to data collected by the UN in 2020, India provided the single largest number of migrants of any country in the world. And the largest number of these migrants traveled to the Gulf, with the UAE topping the list, followed closely by the US. So as someone who's based in New Jersey, which is a hub of South Asian migration in the US, and now spending time in the UAE, I can't help but find myself thinking a lot about continuities and discontinuities between historical and contemporary migration. So while geographically there are certainly important differences, I wanted to highlight at the kind of outset of the talk a few important connections. So these connections include the importance of what scholars term circular migrations. These are migration circuits in which people traveled abroad for a period of years before returning home, sometimes multiple times. And in other cases, I've also found they travel one place, they return home, and then they go abroad to another place. So it's not always like very neat circles, rather kind of like cyclical, circular kind of swirls in some cases. The vast majority of Indian migrants during the British period fit this pattern. Of the 30 million Indians who left the subcontinent, an estimated 24 million are thought to have returned. So we see long-term continuities with, for example, migration to the Gulf today, which also has a lot of these kind of patterns of circularity. And also, as the HRF discussed last fall, there are important legal and bureaucratic legacies from the British period, including the critical way in which ideas of skilled versus unskilled labor structure migration policies. So we talked about Natasha Iskandar's work in this area. And from my own work, I would also point to the centrality of labor contracts as an imperial legacy. So way back in September, I intended a Taji lecture, which was a requirement, I gather a new requirement of getting a UA residency visa. And the lecture, which was actually a pre-recorded sort of animated video, kind of told the story of a migrant, probably from South Asia, unspecified, but seems like he was from South Asia, and his sort of journey and then career in the UAE. But despite the fact that it was kind of framed in this, light-hearted animation, the real kind of message of the video was to explain very clearly all the kind of details of the labor contract and the kind of respective rights and duties that came with signing that labor contract. And so as a historian watching this video, I couldn't help but see parallels with the ways in which the British defended the legitimacy of Indian labor recruitment in the 19th century, and particularly worked to distinguish it from African slavery through an emphasis on the signing of labor contracts. My own research has also looked at the ways in which techniques of using biometrics were often first pioneered to monitor Asian migrants, from ID photography to the use of sort of ID numbers, techniques that start to be experimented with in criminal context are then kind of used to try to control Asian migrants. And many of these are, with us today. We take totally for granted ID photographs and the fact that we all have numbers attached to our names. And if you look at the origins of these, they're really with sort of British attempts to regulate Asian migration. So using these continuities as a point of departure, one of the things I'm trying to explore through my research is how memories of earlier periods of migration continue to shape diasporic identities today. And these are really themes I'm working on right now, in part through conducting oral histories, in some cases with families who are today in the Gulf, but their families first left India in the 19th century. So I'm working with a family who went from India to South Africa, and then from South Africa quite recently to Doha. And I'm trying to kind of use these families to kind of think across kind of long duration periods about sort of what it means to be diasporic. So in trying to, that's not going to be the focus of the talk, but hopefully I'll have conversations with many of you over the next couple of months around those themes. So in trying to draw links between the past and present, I've been drawn to the family as a central site for thinking intergenerationally. Many professional historians are relatively dismissive of so-called roots research, which they see as sort of a hobby. But in contrast, I see families as providing creative, alternative ways of thinking about the relationship between the past and the present. So my work with diasporic families is focused on two main types of archives. The first is documentation produced by colonial bureaucrats. So to show that Indian labor recruitment was different than African slavery, the British built a complex bureaucracy in order to preserve links between migrants and their families in India. And this included detailed recording of their next of kin, the provision in some cases of free postal service for sending letters and remittances home, and facilities for remitting estates when migrants died abroad. The result is that there's much more granular information about Indian migrants and their family connections in many cases than there is available for Indians during the same period who remained in India. And this kind of colonial archive has been kind of quite generative in terms of, in some cases, actually being able to piece together quite detailed information about individuals and their families. But I've also very much tried to read these colonial materials alongside family archives, including oral histories, family heirlooms, and photo albums. But I've been particularly interested at the ways in which these two types of archives intersect. So for example, I've looked at materials that families submitted to colonial courts when disputing inheritance cases. So the first image on the slide is an example of this type of document. It's a family tree written in Urdu that was part of the evidence in a case involving an Indian family spread between Lucknow and Karbala. The second is a more contemporary example. In the past couple of years, as Salila mentioned, I've become sort of almost obsessed with digital genealogy, websites like Ancestry, both to kind of explore them as mediums for thinking about the past, but also as a way of sort of connecting with families. And the image in the slide is an example of an Anglo-Indian family from Calcutta. And one of the photographs in the family tree is taken from a passport, which I found is often the case for older relatives in these trees. Often the only photograph that families have of their great-grandparents were taken from government IDs. And in the case of Asian migrants, often these IDs were racially marked, and in some cases, they were forms of documentation that were only required to be carried by people who are classified as Asian. So it's both, a very kind of bureaucratic form of identification, but also in some cases a highly racialized one. But when such documents are repurposed by families, I think they take on different meanings than their imperial origins. I'm therefore interested in the ways in which families repurpose colonial documents to construct family narratives, and in the process, I think work to kind of unravel, if not completely undo, some of the violence of their initial production. But in working between colonial and family archives, I've been struck by the ways in which they can at times have a common problem. Both often obscure the role of women in diasporic histories. So I think no one in the room would be particularly surprised to learn that colonial archives are biased towards documenting histories of men. But I found that in interviewing families, the narratives that they present also often foreground the role of men. Even in families in which both men and women migrated, the stories of grandfathers and great-grandfathers are often those that the families remember in recounting where we came from. To find women in archives and in interviews, I found myself turning to different sources and kind of different types of questions. In particular, in recent years, I've been drawn to photographs and material objects as sources that help bring women more centrally into histories of migration. So for example, I found that asking families to share photo albums offers an entry point into hearing more about women's diasporic histories. So with these broader themes in mind, I want to now turn back to Janbai, whose story is one of the first I started researching while working on this project, and who in many ways has kind of helped me to come up with some of these larger methods. So Janbai was part of a family that made its fortune trading between Western India, the Gulf, and East Africa, with connections extending outward to China and to the US. Her family, the Topans, made its fortune in the lucrative trade in slaves, spices, ivory, and other goods that linked the Western Indian Ocean. They also came to control the customs revenue for Zanzibar, a position that placed them at the nexus between Omani, British, and global interests in the region. So the history of their family business has normally been told as the story of the family patriarch, Tharia Topan. And you can see in the slide, he's the gentleman, the kind of larger gentleman, kind of most closest to me in the bottom row. So Tharia Topan has featured in a number of works on the Indian Ocean, including the books I've put up on the slide. And in fact, the HRF is going to read Fahad Bashar's book, Sea of Dead, and Fahad is going to be here in a couple of weeks giving a talk at the Institute. And in his book, Tharia Topan has kind of a feature role. But in contrast, Janbai has been sort of all but absent from the scholarship. What I kind of hope to show in the talk is I think that she's actually far more crucial to the family's sort of position in both the kind of economic, religious, and social kind of worlds of the Indian Ocean than has been kind of acknowledged through this focus exclusively on Tharia. So Tharia was also celebrated as a leading member of the Ismaili community. And I probably don't need to say this for this audience, but Ismailis are followers of the Aga Khan. And the particular group of Ismailis that Tharia and Janbai belong to, the Khojas, trace their roots to Western India. They're believed to have converted to Islam around the 13th century. After conversion, they, though, retained some customs with links to local practices, including with respect to how they divided their estates. Some also considered themselves quite early on as followers of the imamate of the descendants of Ismail. But these links were quite a bit further strengthened when Hassan Ali Shah, the 47th Imam and the first to use the title of Aga Khan, fled political strife in Iran in the 1840s and resettled in India. Hassan Ali Shah used the British colonial courts to help consolidate his leadership over his Indian followers, including through a legal case in which he was declared the official head of the community. Some Khojas, however, refused his leadership and afterwards became Sunnis or 12-hour Shias. These divisions were contested through colonial courts and also through kind of an extensive literature of kind of printed tracts. And this history has been the subject of a number of recent studies, but again, these studies have been very male-centric. So they sort of look a lot like the image on the slide. In this case, you have the third Aga Khan, who is enthroned in 1885, who's sort of completely surrounded by sort of his male followers. And much of the historiography on the Ismailis during the 19th century and these sort of how they worked through these sectarian divisions is very much a story of kind of men debating men. But Janbai, like many other Ismaili women, was a devoted follower of the Aga Khan, and I hope to show in the talk, I think women like her were kind of playing a much bigger role in these debates than, again, sort of has been reflected in the scholarship. So in trying to unsettle these male-dominated economic and religious histories, sort of 3-4 kind of major collections of sources have been really important to my work. So I first came across Janbai because I was looking at transnational inheritance disputes among Indian families at the very beginning of this project. And there's a major legal case involving Janbai and her elder stepsons. And so this was kind of the first archive I began exploring. But then in part, after I found these records, I reached out to Tharia Topan, who's the gentleman in the slide, who's the grandson of Tharia and Janbai, to say, you know, have you seen these records? Are you interested? And we then met, and he actually gave me an unpublished biography that his father wrote of Tharia, but that sort of both of us, after kind of talking through it and reading this biography in conversation with the legal case, thought, you know, actually this tells us as much, if not more, about Janbai than about Tharia, because Farouk's father was the youngest of Tharia and Janbai's children, and Tharia passed away when he was like 3 or 4 years old. And so he really barely knew his father, but he had a very kind of long and contentious relationship with his mother. And then a couple of years after working with those two sets of sources, I just happened to come across 2 objects that are now held by the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, which included a bracelet that Janbai gave to the wife of an American sea captain, and a photograph of Janbai that was part of that sort of same gift. And so sort of the narrative that I'm going to construct in the talk, you know, sort of builds on these kind of 3 sets of sources. So unfortunately, Unfortunately, we know relatively little about Janbai before her marriage to Tharia. So I'm going to kind of begin the story with Tharia in 1823 when he's born in Kutch. And Kutch is marked on the map with a blue star. So as a young teenager, Tharia, according to family legend, fled home after being falsely accused of stealing. He stowed away on a dhow that took him to Muscat, marked with a green star on the map. There he helped build export links for his father's oil mill business. And in Muscat, Tharia also joined an influential community of Indian traders, including fellow Khojas. And today, kind of evidence of these links can still be seen in Muscat and in the port of Mathura on its outskirts. And you can kind of see it in the kind of architecture that you see if you kind of walk around the streets. So after spending a few years in Muscat, Tharia eventually returned to Kutch, where he married for the first time, but he was soon on the move again. And so this time he was recruited by the Sultan of Zanzibar to travel to East Africa to help build the island's Indian Ocean trade. So today, Kutch, Muscat, and Zanzibar may seem divided by regional boundaries that separate Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. But in the 19th century, they were closely linked through maritime routes and political geographies. So as I mentioned earlier, Zanzibar was governed by an Omani sultanate that had historically stretched down the east coast of Africa. And the map on the slide is actually today on display at the National Museum of Oman, but I put it in the slide carousel just because I think it gives us a nice sense of this kind of alternative geography. And as the photographs here show, the urban architecture of the growing city in Stone Town, Zanzibar would have looked quite familiar to Tharia with both its Omani and Indian influences. So it's in Zanzibar that Janbai enters our story. By 1863, Tharia had married and become a widower twice. Soon after the death of his second wife, his sons from his first marriage, who were then 20 and 12, decided to help their father find a new wife. They feared a domineering stepmother and wanted a woman who would not challenge their emerging authority within the family. When 12-year-old Janbai walked by the Topan house peddling fruits for her father's business, the Topan sons thought that they'd found the perfect match. Young and from a humble background, they believed that Janbai would be a docile addition to the family. Their assumptions proved wrong, very wrong. As her sons would later describe it, quote, this illiterate girl began to rise to her changed status. So in some ways, it's kind of the classical tale of the evil stepmother. So during the first decade of her marriage to Tharia, Janbai gave birth to 3 healthy daughters. She also, though, lost several sons as infants. And so Janbai was desperate at this point to produce her own male offspring, and she believed that her best hope of securing this end was to ask the Aga Khan to intercede on her behalf. Tharia was apparently less enthused about approaching the Aga Khan to ask for help with having additional children, but Janbai prevailed and the couple made a pilgrimage to India to visit the Aga Khan in 1875. During their visit, the Aga Khan reassured the couple that Janbai would give birth to 3 sons. But he asked in return that they complete a pilgrimage to Karbala with their sons and shave their heads in an act of thanksgiving. In 1881, after the birth of 2 sons, Janbai and Tharia fulfilled this vow by making a pilgrimage to Mecca and to Karbala. So I put up a kind of family tree on the slide just to kind of help keep all of these people straight. So you can see sort of Tharia marries his first wife, and with his first wife, he has 2 sons and a daughter. His second, after the death of his first wife, he marries another wife, but they do not have any children. And then after her death in 1863, very soon after, he marries Janbai. Janbai and Tharia have 3 daughters, and then 2 sons, and then another daughter, and then a final son, Muhammad Hussein, who's the author of the biography that I use as a lot of material for the paper. So in recounting this anecdote, Muhammad Hussein described his mother as a, quote, and this is his word, fanatic Ismaili, a term that suggests deep tensions within the family over what constituted proper religious belief and practice. In contrast, he described his father as a doctrinally correct Muslim who believed that the Aga Khan was, quote, the rightful owner of the throne of imamate, spiritual leadership, and not beyond that. The gendered religious divisions within the Topan household do not seem to have been particularly unusual. I've looked at a number of inheritance cases in Zanzibar in which widows made bequests to the Aga Khan against the wishes of their male relations. As I mentioned earlier, the second half of the 19th century was a period of acute debate among Khojas over their relationship to the Aga Khan. And while the majority would come to identify as Ismailis, some during this period broke away and became Sunnis or Twelver Shias. The role of women in these sectarian debates has largely been understood as a passive one, because it is true that a kind of major issue was around sort of how what share of an inheritance women would receive. Following decisions by the British colonial courts, Khoja Ismailis followed customary inheritance practices in which widows only received a lifetime interest in their husband's estate rather than a Quranic share. After noticing, though, that Khoja widows were donating property rather than allowing it to revert to male relations after their deaths, I began investigating whether this phenomenon was unique to the community in Zanzibar. Interestingly, I found evidence that the gendered split among Khojas in Muscat may have been even more pronounced. British consular reports from Muscat indicate that in the 1880s, the community was split along gendered lines, with Khoja women worshiping separately and sending donations to the Aga Khan, while many of the men in the community had become Twelver Shias. While these sources provide only a glimpse of dynamics that I'm sure were much more complex, they do suggest that women were active participants in these sectarian debates. Their modes of exerting their influence, though, often took material and financial forms, which have at times sort of escaped scholarly attention. Women like Janbai did not author religious polemics. Instead, they made pilgrimages and donated money, material means of articulating religious positions that I think deserve more attention. So Janbai's approach to exerting political influence within Zanzibar's complex geopolitical geographies also took material forms. As I mentioned earlier, Zanzibar was ruled by a dynasty of Omani sultans with whom the Topans carefully cultivated political and social alliances. In 1882, Janbai and Tharia were ready to arrange marriages for their two middle daughters. A few years earlier, they had married off their eldest daughter in a simple ceremony. But in the meantime, Tharia had purchased the right to farm the customs revenue for Zanzibar. This was a lucrative position that set him at the nexus between Omani political power and the growing influence of British colonial officials. When it came time to marry off her other daughters, Janbai was therefore determined to broadcast the family's elevated position. She handpicked the grooms and insisted that the Sultan should personally attend the wedding. Apparently, this request went against local customs, which dictated that the Sultan did not attend weddings outside his own household. Tharia was ready to defer to custom, but Janbai was not. According to her son, the Sultan knew that Janbai was, quote, not an easy nut to crack like Tharia, and acquiesced to her request. To emphasize this unusual honor, Janbai arranged to have red carpets imported from Bombay and laid along the streets from the palace to the Topan's home, and crowds gathered to watch the royal procession. On arrival, the Topans presented the Sultan with a specially crafted chair of carved wood covered in silver plate. The chair was crafted by Ceylonese furniture makers who'd recently moved to Zanzibar to meet the growing demand for luxury furnishings. So the picture on the slide is not that chair, but it's a similar style chair, also believed to have belonged to the Sultan, which I sort of found online, had been auctioned in Florida a couple of years ago. Janbai also arranged for a famous dancer to travel all the way from Egypt to entertain the guests. In describing these festivities, her son Muhammad Hussein expressed disapproval for his mother's domineering obstinance and her lavish taste. He acknowledged, however, that people in Zanzibar remembered the wedding decades later. So these anecdotes, as related by Tharia and Janbai's son, illustrate how Janbai exerted influence in worlds dominated by men. They tell us much less, however, about her networks with other women, ties with which her son may have been less familiar. But even in this area, Muhammad Hussein offers a few suggestive hints. In the biography, he included a somewhat surprising aside, and remember, this is actually a biography of his father, but he has several pages in his biography in which he detailed the customs that elite women in Zanzibar observed when visiting other women. He detailed how these visits normally happened in the evening, and the women of one household would process with lighted lanterns to the home of the host. Once there, the elite women would gather indoors while the slaves and servants of both households socialized on the roof. The slide depicts a contemporary view from the roof of the Topan's former home, which is now a boutique hotel in Zanzibar. When slave women gathered on the rooftop, they would be visible from the street. And I think I put the slide here because I think we can kind of imagine what this might have looked like. Thus, even when they were not serving the household directly, they were broadcasting their wealth by their visible embodied presence. Herself from a humble home, Janbai seems to have been particularly attuned to such modes of communicating status. She, for example, purchased silver jewelry specifically to be worn by the Topan slaves, adornments which were sort of visible symbols of her mastery and power. So for further evidence of how Janbai cultivated connections with women, we can look to other archives. In this respect, my discovery of the photograph of Janbai and the bracelet in the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem was crucial. The objects were gifts to a woman named Carolyn Batchelder, who was married to the captain of a ship which was named after Tharia. So this is the kind of ship. And both Carolyn and her husband traveled on the ship to Zanzibar. So she actually visited the family. Carolyn visited the Topans in Zanzibar. And the ship was owned by a prominent merchant from Salem, Massachusetts, who was a close trade associate of the Topans. So today, the connection to Salem may seem a bit surprising. Today, Salem is a sleepy New England town known almost exclusively for its infamous role in staging witchcraft trials in the 17th century. Historically, however, Salem was a major port with particularly strong connections to the Indian Ocean trade routes. In the first half of the 19th century, the United States was the largest international trade partner of Zanzibar, and much of this trade was routed through Salem. During this period, cotton mills in Salem produced fine white cotton cloth specifically for export to East Africa, where it was locally referred to as Merikani in Swahili. On the return journey, Salem ships brought back gum copal, a resin used to finish furniture, and ivory. By the 1880s, when Carolyn visited Zanzibar, this trade was in decline, but ties between the Topans and Salem merchants continued to be strong. Historians have studied these ties through letters exchanged between Tharia and male merchants in Massachusetts. The bracelet and photograph, however, suggest that women were also part of these business connections. In fact, these merchant families made their fortunes selling domestic goods, the purchase of which often was influenced by women. And this was certainly the case in the Topan family. Tharia was infamously frugal and reportedly only changed his clothes every few days. Janbai was the one driving the family's conspicuous consumption. Given women's centrality as consumers of domestic goods, their role in helping to manage business relations involving these goods deserves greater attention. So the photograph of Janbai, which she also gifted to Carolyn along with the bracelet, I think opens up yet another avenue for thinking about how she connected with other women. So when I first encountered this photograph, I was sort of overjoyed to have actually found a photograph of Janbai. I'd seen so many photographs of Tharia, I mean, in museums in Zanzibar, online, in historical scholarship, but I had not been able to see a picture of Janbai. So I was really excited to find the photograph of her, but I was also frustrated because to me, it just kind of looked flat. Janbai's expression is neutral, and the objects with which she was photographed don't tell us really anything about her. In fact, the book, which is on the table next to her, is kind of distinctly at odds with the fact that she was unable to read or write. And so kind of at a loss for what to do with this photograph, I turned to kind of looking at the broader social history of photography in the Indian Ocean and in East Africa. And this ultimately proved really kind of fruitful because Zanzibar has a very long history with photography. So as early as the 1840s, a French photographer visited the island and photographed several elite Omani and Swahili families, including women. In 1875, while visiting London, Sultan Syed Burgash commissioned a photographic carte de visite, which he distributed among many of the island's elite on his return. So by the 1880s, which is about when I think the photograph of Janbai was taken, a number of photography studios had opened in Zanzibar, and in fact, many were run by families from Goa. And I think Janbai's photograph needs to be read in this context as part of both local and global circuits of images. So in the slide, I've included two other photographs of women from Zanzibar. The three women are all positioned in what I think is a strikingly similar way, with their hands resting against their heads. The image in the middle, which is the most famous of these images, was of Saida Salome, the daughter of the Sultan, who famously eloped with a German merchant and moved to Hamburg. And the photograph of Saida is actually was taken in Hamburg in the 1860s. And it became very famous because it became the frontispiece for a memoir that she wrote about her kind of life adventures. But it seems very likely, because it's in collections in Zanzibar, that this photograph was circulating in Zanzibar even earlier. And so I think there's a distinct chance that either Janbai or the photographer who took her photograph had actually seen the picture of Saida. And I think this is even further reinforced by the third image that I also came across, which is of an unnamed Indian woman, but who is also sort of positioned very similarly to the other two. So I think reading these sort of three photographs together sort of suggests that there are kind of new visual vocabularies of class and cosmopolitan that are circulating among the island's elite. By having her photograph taken, quite possibly in a position that imitated a rebel princess, and then gifting the image to Caroline, Janbai positioned herself within global circuits of powerful women. So a few years after Caroline and Janbai met in Zanzibar, the Topan shifted their household to Bombay. Meanwhile, Tharia's elder sons from his first marriage remained in Africa to tend the family's business interests there. By the 1880s, when the family moved, Bombay had emerged as the epicenter of the Indian Ocean trade circuits, and it made sense for the family to have a physical presence there. The Aga Khan also lived down the road from the Topans, and Tharia was able to access better medical care as his health worsened. Perhaps he knew that his days were numbered. Soon after arriving in Bombay, he enlisted the services of one of the city's top law firms to draft his will, an elaborate document written in Gujarati. Tharia made dozens of different bequests to various family members, and he also gave gifts to a variety of different charitable causes, from funds to construct a hospital in Zanzibar in honor of Queen Victoria, to donations to the shrine of a local female peer in his hometown in Kutch. Tharia, however, struggled to satisfy the competing claims of his wife and elder sons from his first marriage. These tensions played out against the backdrop of larger debates within the Ismaili community about whether to follow customary or Quranic inheritance practices. Initially, Tharia followed the former, specifying that the property that Janbai inherited should revert to his male heirs after his death, as was often the case in Hindu families. Janbai, however, pressed for more, and her physical presence in Bombay worked to her advantage. Meanwhile, Tharia's elder sons could only advocate for their rights via letters that they exchanged frequently with their father. And in the end, Janbai seems to have prevailed. Before his death in 1891, Tharia added 5 codicils to his will that bequeathed additional property to Janbai and her children, and gave her full property rights over her share. So Tharia passed away in February 1891, and within 6 months, his family was entangled in a legal dispute that would involve them in years of litigation and consume lakhs of their family's fund in legal fees. Janbai sought to defend the additional bequest, while her stepsons argued that she had exerted, quote, undue influence on their ailing father. While the case was initially heard before the Bombay High Court, which is pictured on the slide, the family eventually pursued the case all the way to the Privy Council in London. Ultimately, Janbai largely won the case, with the court upholding most of the additional bequests to her. This victory, however, came at great cost, both financial and emotional. Even her own son, Muhammad Hussein, would later blame his mother for the family's mounting financial difficulties. Yet Janbai was not discouraged from pursuing her interests via the colonial courts, and she lodged several additional suits in the coming years to defend her wealth from creditors, employees, and even her own children. Despite his protest, Mohammed Hussein eventually came to depend on rents from properties that his mother owned in Zanzibar and which she had defended through litigation. And then finally, 4 decades after Tharia passed away, Janbai died in Zanzibar in 1934. So I want to conclude with a few broader thoughts. I hope that you found Janbai as fascinating a character as I have, but my point here is not just to tell a good story. Instead, I think shifting our perspective towards a woman like Janbai and thinking through how she exerted influence in Indian Ocean circuits opens up several new analytical and methodological pathways. So first, Janbai pushes us to rethink the role that women played in Indian Ocean markets. In recent years, the Indian Ocean has emerged as a particularly vibrant area of scholarly inquiry, and trade and markets have been central areas of study. One of the offshoots of this research has been more sustained scholarly interest in family business, which I think you can see here in the Family Business History Project. But to a large extent, histories of family businesses in the Manasseh region, and particularly if we're speaking historically, I think this is particularly true, have been told as histories of fathers and sons and uncles and nephews. As I suggested earlier, I think this is in part the result of a kind of overlapping patriarchal bias in sort of colonial conventions of record keeping, as well as sort of the ways that families sometimes narrate their stories. But it also reflects entrenched gender bias in our understanding of capital, which is one of the reasons I titled my talk Gendered Capital. And this is something I'm trying to kind of work through and kind of refine further as an argument. So famously, Marx defined capital as money that generates more money. Women's economic activity, including within family businesses, is too often instead understood as consumptive and therefore not capital generating. In fact, Tharia himself viewed his wife's expenditures in this way. And so he complained about her, and more generally, that women do not at all know how to preserve wealth. Yet Marx himself might have viewed Janbai's activities differently. He, for example, noted that when capitalists spend money on luxuries, they make themselves appear more creditworthy and thus gain access to more capital. More recent scholarship on social capital certainly supports reading Janbai's expenditures on gifts and entertaining as investments in building the Topan's political and economic connections. Bringing such activities more solidly into economic histories of the Manasseh region and really globally, I think requires rethinking what we think of when we talk about kind of economic or business history. Second, Janbai suggests different ways to conceive of women's role in religious movements in the 19th and 20th century. So I originally approached the Topans primarily from the perspective of Indian Ocean trade, but then last spring, a couple of colleagues convinced me to contribute to a special journal issue on Muslim modernities. And because this is what I was working on, I said, okay, well, I'll write an article, but only if I can write it about Janbai, because that's what I'm obsessed with right now. And at first I was sort of hesitant. I didn't think that Janbai seemed like a great fit for the topic. There's little to suggest that she engaged with modernity as a concept. And she certainly did not read or write or even read the sorts of reformist texts that have dominated scholarship on Muslim modernities among South Asianists. But at the same time, Janbai was definitely devout. And I think we have to sort of be more critical of the ways in which her son sort of dismissed her piety as sort of fanatical, or sort of, even if we kind of interpret it more positively, as sort of traditional or in some way backwards. But I think if you actually look at the ways in which she's expressing this piety, you see that many aspects of what she's doing are in fact engaged with distinctly modern innovations. So she's taking a steamship to go both to India and on pilgrimage to the Hajj. And I think in earlier generations, a woman like Janbai might not have gone on these sorts of long distance pilgrimages because it would have been so much more difficult to travel. And even within the type of sort of religious festivities that she is sort of holding, whether for marriages or also for Tharia's funeral, they're kind of very much wrapped up in forms of sort of consumption that are very much about consuming kind of modern goods. So instead, I think we can understand Janbai's religiosity as material and embodied modes of engaging in contemporary debates among Ismailis about religious authority. Ismaili women did not, for the most part, participate in these religious debates by authoring texts. And in Janbai's case, she did not even seem to have consumed such texts. Instead, they participated by making pilgrimages, donating funds, and worshiping in separate spaces. If we focus on text alone, we therefore can miss how women were critical in 19th century struggles over religious authority. And this brings me to my sort of final point, which is to underline the importance of materiality and visuality, both as archival and analytical approaches. So tracing forms of economic and religious influence that Janbai exercised requires rereading textual archives with more attention to material evidence of objects, spaces, and flows of money. It also draws us towards sources, including images and objects, which historians often continue to neglect. So historians, and here I would particularly say modern historians, so Leela, I think the sort of pre-modern historians are much better about this, but modern historians as a field sort of remain very textually oriented. And I think this has been particularly true when I think of the kind of field in which I was trained, which is sort of Islam in South Asia in the 19th and 20th century. It's all about kind of finding and reading texts. But I think that this kind of emphasis on text has introduced a kind of important structural bias because during this period, women's rates of literacy were so much lower. So in India, for the 19th and early 20th century, only 1% of women were literate, and this is 1/10 the number of men in comparison. And so if we sort of really focus on textual archives, which even in the case of studies of sort of Muslim women in South Asia have been the kind of main sources, we're not going to find very many women. And this is sort of despite the fact that, thinking all the way back to Gayatri Spivak's seminal intervention about, can the subaltern speak, we still are kind of looking for women's voices. And for the most part, where we're looking for their voices is in text. But when Janbai entered textual archives, she often sought to avoid speaking rather than to be heard. For example, during the litigation over Tharia's estate, when she was compelled to testify, she offered only one-word answers, effectively using silence as a strategy. In strategic moments, however, Janbai maneuvered to be seen, most markedly in the circulation of her photograph. In Janbai's case, therefore, agency is better understood not by searching for her voice, but by tracking her presence. Turning to material and visual archives is thus both a matter of broadening our source base and asking new questions about materiality and visuality as modes of historical agency.